Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the Township of Woolwich Council meeting on April 4th, 2023. We are now live on YouTube, and just a note of explanation. Yes, I am wearing a Kitchener-Waterloo Siskins jersey. That was a friendly wager between Mayor Dorothy McCabe of Waterloo and myself on the Siskins and Kings series. It was a hard fought series, and our Sugar Kings had a really good year. But unfortunately, they did lose in that series to the Siskins, and hence the jersey tonight. I'll start with roll call. I'm Mayor Shaunson present and chairing this meeting. Councillor Bryant has a personal matter. Councillor Burgess.
Present.
Councillor Cadeau.
Present.
Councillor Grant.
Present.
Councillor Schwint.
Present.
Thank you. Can I have a motion that council reconvenes in open session? Moved by Councillor Cadeau, seconded by Councillor Grant. All those in favor? That's carried. I acknowledge the land on which we live has been here from time immemorial, and the Indigenous people have lived here from time immemorial. I thank the Shinaton, also called Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people who have lived here and cared for this land and who continue to share and steward this land with us. May we together learn to care for each other, our flora and fauna, and the land that sustains us. Today, we heard of another fatality on our roads. And in the moment of silence, I think I'd ask us to remember those who have died on our roads and consider how we can all be safe drivers. Take a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. There are no items to come forward from closed. We do have minutes from Committee of the Whole, March 7th, and Council, March 21st. Can I have a mover and a seconder for those minutes? Moved by Councillor Schwint, seconded by Councillor Cadeau. All those in favor? And that's carried. We have no public meetings or presentations, but we do have a delegation. And before we hear from the delegates, I will have some instructions to read. You have a maximum of 7 minutes to speak unless council or the clerk has set a different time. There will be a timer on the screen and you will hear a warning when you have 1 minute and when your time is up. Once you are finished, please wait for questions of clarification from council. When there are no more questions for you, please. I guess you have to turn off your video because you're all here. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the discussion or meeting if you'd like to, or leave quietly. Council discussion and debate will start when all questions of clarification have finished. So our first item is official plan amendment 2/2022 and zone change 5/2022, 39A holdings. And Mr. Vink, do you have anything to add? I think we had this last week. Ms. Fries.
Hi, Mr. Vink's not on the call today, just I'm on the call. I don't think I have anything to add. We were presented to council at the last meeting, but the consultant is also here with their experts, and they can respond to any technical questions.
Okay, thank you. Then, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
If I can ask a question of staff, just historical context. The old dump site, who was responsible for decommissioning that dumper? Who owned it when it was in operation? Was that the township? Was it the region, or was it private citizen?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it was my understanding that it was a privately owned landfill. So not owned by the township or the region.
Mr. Marshall?
Good evening, Woolwich councillors, staff and citizens.
I'm a little surprised by the comment the staff person just made. I believe Cecil Bolander was the original owner of the property, and I believe he had leased it to, the town of Elmira originally. Yes, there have been several private buyers and owners from Chris Pilecki, Frank Radisson, et cetera, and now 39A Holdings, but it was a town dump for municipal and industrial wastes starting in 1962. Okay, moving to my delegation. My first draft of this delegation was about misinformation being transmitted to the public and to councillors as well. That misinformation was in regards to the imaginary clay cap that does not exist and has never existed over the top of the Bolander Park landfill. We were advised yesterday by RJ Burnside that, quote, and this is their new position, quote, it is not a full clay cap as the actual amount of clay is low, unquote. This interpretation is acceptable if you feel that the claim of a clay cap is justified by no clay cap being found in a total of 36 different test pits and boreholes on the site. This is on both the east side and the west side of the Bolander landfill. There never has been and never was a clay cap. And quite frankly, nobody would expect a clay cap on a landfill that's been closed for over half a century. We were advised in the March 8th, 2018 Woolwich Observer that Woolwich Council endorsed the Director of Planning, Engineering and Planning's recommendations to proceed with constructing additional methane probes, a detection system, and a passive methane trench for the Bolander landfill. This followed similar recommendations from GHD consultants in 2017, the year prior. These were recommendations from GHD to Woolwich Township in 2017. These recommendations and council endorsement seem to have disappeared since the advent of the proposed truck parking lot. And I have handed out to council via, is it Dolores? I'm sorry. I've handed out copies of the Observer article for each of the council members to Alex. My apologies. All efforts for the past 40 years to collect and vent methane gas from the Bolander landfill have been unsuccessful. I say this based upon the never-ending, unacceptably high methane gas concentrations found in the subsurface from 1983 until 2021. We are not talking of methane concentrations barely exceeding the LEL or lower explosive limit of approximately 5 to 5.5%. We're talking methane concentrations, 20, 30, 60, 70% in the subsurface. This landfill was built and then closed in 1970 without leachate or methane controls. Regarding yesterday's RJ Burnside written proposal to repair and lightly regrade the sand and gravel cap prior to adding more gravel on top for the parking lot, let me advise council thusly. Even when the proponents or consultants were selling the gravel cap as a clay cap, this was likely no more than window dressing to basically get you to buy into the parking lot proposal. In other words, they were putting, I think the saying, they were putting lipstick on a pig. Another expression is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. None of these proposals to grade the gravel cap or add gravel on top are going to reduce the methane production and likely migration one iota. And furthermore, it might make it worse. I'm not here pretending to be a methane expert, but I will say this. Woolwich councillors, you have inherited a bit of a mess that past councils and staff have, we'll say, avoided for decades, for lack of a stronger word. You can either do the same, or you could get real landfill and methane experts to assist you. You haven't had them in the past, and I do not recommend the consultants that you have been using over the last 4 decades. It's not a one-way street. They made a few good recommendations. They made a few bad recommendations, and councils historically have accepted some, rejected others, and ignored most of them, which is why 40 years later, you still have methane at horrible, dangerous concentrations that should have been, by all standards, either vented decades ago naturally or with gas probes that were working. And most of the gas probes haven't worked for various reasons, including the high water table, among others. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to help.
Are there any questions? No, not seeing any.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Handy. And Mr. Walls, right?
That's me, Mr.
Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Shantz, members of council, staff, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hugh Handy and I'm a land use planner and vice president at GSP Group. Jim Walls, who is also from Burnsides, we are here on behalf of our client 39A Holdings Limited. Our client, Rob Shapiro, sends his regrets tonight. He was to join virtually, but had a business emergency. Tom Helinski, Mr. Shapiro's solicitor, is on the line should there be any questions of him as well. We're here tonight. Obviously, we've made a presentation before. Jim has made a presentation. We're here as a joint delegation this evening. And Jim has a short presentation to follow up on some of the questions that still remain. And we've been hopefully trying to answer those through the process and at the committee of the whole. I have also with me Nathan Miller with NRSI if there's any further questions on natural heritage or the trees. We're here, as I said, to provide any further information, and Jim has a short presentation that he'll make this evening. What I wanted to do is just reiterate, it is our professional responsibility as providing advice to our client and providing council, staff, and the public the facts. And we don't take those lightly, and our recommendations are cemented in our organizations and our credentials. Again, we look for your support tonight of council for the applications, and maybe I'll turn it over to Jim to make a presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Good evening, all. Slideshow, please. I'm Jim Walls of RJ Burnside. I'm a licensed geoscientist in 4 provinces and 2 territories, and my license requires that I put the interests of public health and safety and the environment before anything I do for a client. That is my one of my primary duties. I'm also, as part of my license, required to be ethical. That means if I stand up here and lie and I'm caught doing that, I can lose my licenses to work in all jurisdictions across the provinces and territories. So I try to be careful with that. Next slide, please. As we've discussed tonight, we know the landfill footprint on this property. The side of the property to the west has been used for parking and things like an automotive recycling facility for decades without incident. The portion to the east is what we want to expand the parking over. Next slide, please. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. So what you see here is the surface vegetation and the landfill cap. You can see in this photo, the percentage of clay in the cap material is probably pretty low, a lot of silt, a little bit of gravel, mixed material. Underneath that, you have the waste. So you can see the cap is pretty thick in this slide. Next slide, please. The cap here again, you can see the light colored blocky material on the top. So there is some clay content in that cap that's holding it in place. Underneath is the waste. And in one area, you can see a fissure that's going from the waste to surface. It's a sign of some subsidence over time as the waste is decayed and settled. And those are the kind of things that we need to repair. Next slide, please. Another good view of what the cap looks like. In this case, that's exactly what we want to see. We want to see a thick cap without any fissures, without damage overlying the waste. Next slide, please. Another example of the cap, and you can see the way the bucket of the excavator has smeared the soil at the one side of the pit, so that we know that there is clay and silt in that part, and we know it's the cap's in pretty good shape. Seems to be pretty solid over the waste. Next slide. This is just a sketch that I put together quickly. Methane is generated in the waste. It's lighter than air, so it migrates towards the surface, and it filters through the cap very slowly because the cap, as you saw, is much more impermeable than the waste. It does not go downwards into the water table. It tends, because it's lighter than air, it goes up. That little figure of a stick with a screen in it is what our gas probes look like. They're just like a well. Instead of taking out water, we take out gases. So we come to the top of that monitor, we put an instrument in, we inhale all the vapor out of the soil, and we test the percentage of methane. So that is the worst case methane we can find on the site that has been reported. And the D4 study process requires us to go into the middle of the waste, into the worst part, and find methane. This methane is really, really low. If I went into some of the swamps and nearby wetlands, we would find, as you know, if you go and walk around in a wetland and bubbles bubble up, you will find methane of these readings in those wetlands. You also notice that when you see workers at landfills running heavy equipment and trucks going up on top of the landfill and dumping out waste, and landfill workers walking around, those are active landfills, and the methane that's coming out of those landfills is actually coming out under pressure, and yet it's still safe for workers to work and operate on that. So I don't want to minimize the problems with methane, but I also don't want to overemphasize their risks in this case. The cap is supposed to be sloped, so surface water will run off the cap and not infiltrate and create leachate in the waste. So the cap that's on this site is supposed to operate like this, and it needs a little bit of repair. Next slide, please. This was an example of methane curve of how methane peaks in production when the waste is relatively fresh. And over time, as the organics in the waste decompose, the amount of methane in the waste slows down radically. And what this slide is trying to show is between like 1970 and 2023, the ability of this waste to generate methane has really reduced. The organic mass in the waste has declined over time such that it just can't produce very much methane anymore. So the residual methane that we're detecting in the worst case in our gas probes is the worst that could be generated, and the mass will continue to reduce slowly over time for the next number of decades. Next slide, please. So we studied this under Ministry of Environment's guideline D4, land use on or near landfills and dumps. It's an old guideline, still in use, it's very well done. And it's for planning authorities to determine what types of land use are appropriate near landfill waste. And the quote is there, a guide for land use planning authorities and technical experts on how the presence and potential harm from methane in soils around landfill waste is assessed. And this guideline protects the health, safety, convenience, and welfare of, I think it's residents, from the potential adverse effects of landfills and dumps by restricting or controlling land use in their vicinity. So this was the study that we were required to do, The municipality had GHD do a peer review. We reviewed the comments, made changes, they reviewed it again, and were fine with it. The ministry also reviewed it, and they were fine with the proposed use. Next slide, please. And to be extra careful, we have committed to a 2-year, 4-season monitoring program that will be conducted once the construction of the parking lot is complete. Why not do it now? because all our work so far, we've found no detections of methane at surface. The only places we can detect methane is right in the middle of the residual waste mass in the center of the landfill. So we had one probe that was in the cap, and we had a small detection there. All the other places, the cap was too thin or not really in good condition, so it really didn't trap anything, and all our results were zero. So we're not really detecting anything at surface, and we don't expect to, but we'll do this 2-year monitoring program. The results will be provided to the township, public, and the Ministry of Environment for their review. Obviously, if there's any issues, we will address them at that time. Are there any questions?
Council? Councillor Schwinn.
I guess is dump 101 for me. We have the dump, above it we have the cap. What effect we're having 6 to 8 inch, 12 inches gravel on top of that have on methane seepage up and water seepage down to the dump?
The cap is supposed to slope away to make sure surface water runs away, so it's going to be contoured that way. So the infiltration into the landfill won't change with the gravel layer on top. And methane migration out of the landfill won't change as long as the cap stays the same, whether you have gravel on top or grass or any other surface. It doesn't change the effectiveness of the cap.
Anyone else? Councillor Cadeau.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you, to the delegates, some of the questions that have been coming across my desk relate more to the safety aspect of things. And I am not an expert in all things methane or landfills, so I'm just wondering if you could explain some of the safety concerns. Notably, I was asked, do I feel safe being around the site? And I'm just wondering if you can offer some insights into that question that could help me answer some questions to residents.
Sure. People should feel very safe around this site. As you see, the west end of the site has been used for decades without incident. And you see heavy equipment running around on active landfill and they don't blow up and people don't faint or anything like that. So it's just putting in perspective how dangerous methane is. In this case, the methane is really low in the worst case areas, and we're not detecting anything at surface. One of the reasons why we're not proposing buildings is because buildings could possibly, if they were sitting on ground, have methane build up inside them because they're containers. In this case, we're just parking transport trucks up off the ground. So there's no way, if we can't detect methane at surface, you're going to get any accumulating in a vessel. So the site is very, very safe. And you are probably aware that there are mounds of landfill material in cities where people use them for little ski hills and children's playgrounds and things like that. Sometimes they have vents to vent the methane out. Sometimes they don't if they're really old and the methane isn't being generated. So in this case, we're not asking to return it into parkland, but there is an option. So there's a lot of examples where our most sensitive land uses have been applied on top of landfill.
The follow-up question, I don't know if you're able to pull up the slide, but that graph that you showed, I was hoping you could provide a little bit more context into it because I know that there were 2 dates there and I think that I understand it. I just wanted to confirm. It's almost like you're giving a display and then those 2 dates that have been added in, the 1970 and the 2023, those were additions just to give reference on this graph?
Yes, exactly. This is a typical landfill gas generation curve that the US EPA's had in their publication for years. And we always grab it as a rule of thumb because it's just a really good illustration of how methane gas production declines after a landfill is closed. So when a landfill is open, it's always producing methane, but we take the date of when it's closed and then watch how it declines. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is just between 1970 and 2023, the reduction in methane that's happening over the time as the mass of organic material that can decay and produce methane declines. So when we were digging out there, almost all the organics in that waste are gone. All that's left is metal and plastic and bottles and cans and things like that that do not decay and produce methane. So most of the methanogenic production is gone from the waste. I couldn't create more methane if I tried.
So I suppose a follow-up question, and I don't know if it's appropriate to the delegation or if it would be more of a question for staff is, I mean, we are right next to a creek, and if this material is going to stay there for the foreseeable future, is that concerning? Do we have to worry about some of the leachate? And I mean, I suppose I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but if we were to go into some of the documentation that was provided, are there any of these things that it seems, if this is accurate, were agreed to, or at least exploring? And again, I don't know if this is the question for you, but
It is.
perhaps you can.
But before Robert purchased this property, he came to us, and I've worked with him on other properties, including a former salvage yard. So first thing we look at is, what are your liabilities here? And, there's a former landfill. That's a big concern. So the first thing we did is there anything going off site? Gas or contamination in groundwater? And the first thing we did was we put in a bunch of monitoring wells and sampled the monitoring wells that already exist to make sure that there was no contamination leaving the site, because he would be liable for that if he owned the property. So that was an extremely nervous situation for him. We had to make sure that there was nothing going off this site and maintaining the cap. We also drilled right into the mass of the landfill and put wells in below to see what the groundwater was as a worst case. And then we could model out from there. And what we found was it was fairly benign. The ability of this material to produce contamination has been reduced after so many years.
Councillor Grant.
Thank you. Through you, Councillor or Mayor Shantz. I'm doing it this weekend. To the applicant, I just want to thank you for your presentation. I think it has been informative, and it's clear that you've done a lot of work on this site to present us with as much information as possible, which I think is quite helpful, especially when we are dealing with something like a landfill right next to a park. So I just wanted to say thank you for this. The chart that Councillor Cadeau had you pull up, I found particularly informative. So this is just to say that I've been impressed by the amount of due diligence that the applicant has shown in generating this proposal.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Discussion council, there is a motion in front of you. We're gonna have from committee of the whole, yes. Someone like to move it, or Councillor Schwint, seconded by Councillor Grant. Is there any discussion? Councillor Cadeau.
Sorry, I had my microphone on this whole time. I didn't even notice. Through you, Mayor, to staff, I was wondering if we could get some information related to this news article, whether or not there was methane collection trenches or a collection system, methane collection system.
Ms. Freeze?
Through you, Madam Chair, we can look into it and see if we can find out more information.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of reading through this now. Township allocated $75,000 in 2018 budget. Perhaps, Richard, are you able to speak to that?
Sure.
Derek?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Shantz, to Councillor Cadeau's question. We did contain budget monies for the methane monitoring component, which was borne by the township's involvement as using the property as a landfill. It was not owned by the township; it was owned privately, but was used by the township for landfill purposes. It was always determined to install a passive methane collection system. However, unfortunately, with the previous owner, the one prior to Mr. Shapiro, we were not permitted on site to do any of that work, nor could we install that. There was monitoring occurring in the building. The fire department had regularly monitored the building that exists on the property to ensure that there were no dangerous levels of methane occurring there. But unfortunately, we were just not able to implement the passive system. So the township then shifted gears, focused on the perimeter. We then monitored the perimeter of the property to ensure that methane was not leaching off property and that there were no high levels or concerns surrounding the property. We have corroborated that is that's factual, and we have submitted to the Ministry for relief from ongoing monitoring. So that was a 2-year continuous monitoring program that is wrapped up. It is filed currently with the ministry, and they are reviewing that. And our request or petition now is to absolve any further township involvement from methane monitoring, and that this would be the sole responsibility of the current owner, Mr. Shapiro.
Mr. Petherick, did you want to add anything before we move on to the next question?
No, I think for the most part, I believe Jared or Mr. Bouquet has actually covered off everything. I think to Councillor Godot's question, I don't have the 2017 budget in front of me, but we were spending a few significant dollars with the monitoring program that we had in place for a number of years ago. But we've since been able to sort of back off on the expenditures of that, because I think, as Mr. Bouquet has indicated, we've a lot of work has been done, and we've seen the decline in the methane gas.
Thank you. I think I saw a hand over here, Councillor Schwinn.
I guess we've had a lot of discussion on the methane production at the site, and we're looking at, to me, a planning proposal and information we've seen the last 3 weeks. I don't think parking trucks on a gravel parking lot is going to affect methane production on or off site at all. They're kind of two distinct issues. There's a planning issue to my parking lot there. Secondly, does the township have an obligation, a desire to be worried about methane at this farmer dump and probably a couple other farmer dumps in the township? And that's probably worthy of discussion too, but I'd caution that we shouldn't mix them up in this decision.
Anything else? I'll call the question then. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. Moving on to unfinished business then. St. Jacobs BIA area 2023 budget. Mr. Brenneman? Are you doing this one? Your name is on here for the BIA?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, through you to council. So if you recall, at last week's committee of the whole meeting, there was a presentation from the St. Jacobs BIA with respect to their budget. What we recommended at that time at council defer the approval pending for us to have a further discussion with the BIA with respect to their budget, more specifically the $10,000 that they had allocated for support for allowing for use of some of the commercial properties for public washrooms. And just to provide a little bit of context for council on this particular subject, is that certainly one of the ongoing discussions between the township and the St. Jacobs BIA since the transition from the previous Mercedes Corporation Shantz family to a BIA type of environment has been the fact that there wasn't the same availability of strategically located washrooms. Simply put, Mercedes owned a number of properties, allowed the washrooms to be utilized as public washrooms, even for bus tours and things of that nature. But we weren't getting the same sort of situations occurring once the transition went to a BIA type and individual businesses, made the decisions of their own right. Certainly so that provides a little bit of context between Mercedes Corp and the BIA. Further background and context that I can provide is along came the pandemic, and people were very concerned about the amount of time, effort, and cost it was going to take to clean washrooms on a regular basis to public health standards, during the pandemic. And so we certainly provided some funding to the BIA to deal with that situation, to create some, I guess, strategic locations and availability of washrooms. And all, with an understanding that we've had ongoing discussions with them about the long-term future. Because it is, in my opinion, the most significant tourist area within this region. We get a lot of visitor traffic, to that area. And, as such, there really isn't, like you would see maybe if you go to other places like Laura or Grand Bend or whatever, a public washroom facility owned and operated and cleaned by the municipality. So you may recall in the capital forecast, that is in the capital forecast for a few years down the road. But in the meantime, the question has come up, what sort of stopgap measures should we have even after the pandemic? And so our apologies for the fact that, we had to defer the situation from last week, but we're going to rectify that in the future, because one of the things we're going to do sitting down with both BIAs is to set timeframes around when we need to see the documents, because even our director of finance hadn't seen the information before last week. And so we need a time to talk about the budget, what's coming forward, et cetera. And we're going to get on a better path for next year in terms of meeting those expectations. I know I'm providing a lot of background and context, but I think it's important that council has all that background, because there's been a lot of history pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and even as we head towards the future with this capital forecast. So a long-winded way of saying that we have had discussions directly with the BIA from last week. We understand what they're looking to achieve this year is a collaborative model whereby certain businesses will provide public access to their washrooms. And for that, they will get a certain amount of money to be able to provide that public washroom access. And to that end, they are still looking for us to support the $10,000 that we've been providing over the last 2 years, and for that to continue until such time as we have a long-term solution on a public washroom facility there. And I would note that staff's recommendation is that we continue to support this as a stopgap measure. And further, that we believe that it would be appropriate to use the municipal accommodation tax levy reserve fund and not impact the tax levy itself, because the MAT tax is being collected for tourism related purposes. And so we're not asking for an increase to the tax levy or the budget and opening up the budget for something like this, but rather that you allocate by resolution $10,000 from the municipal accommodation tax reserve fund. This evening, in case there's any questions, I also have Jenna Morris, our Economic Development and Tourism Officer. And Nick Benninger, Chair of the St. Jacobs BIA, is here. And then Richard can also ask any questions related to the municipal accommodation tax and use of that levy. So, like I said, long-winded way, but I wanted to give you that historical context that there's been a lot of discussions between us and the current BIA, because a lot of things changed and transitioned between the old Mercedes Corp and Sean's family to a business improvement association. And one of them, interesting enough, was the issue around public access to washrooms. And so we also believe that considering the extent and cost that ultimately that this will be in terms of building a facility, for now, this is a reasonable stopgap measure. So staff would be happy to answer any questions. Or as I said, Nick Benninger is here as chair of the St. Jacobs BIA to talk about the collaborative model if you have any questions about how they came up with that specifically specific model.
Questions, Councillor Cadeau?
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to CAO Brenneman. Do we have a timeline on, what the end goal would be? If this is the stopgap measure, I would hate to see this continue on for a few years, right?
Yeah. Thomas, if you could jump on, I think it's 2025 in the forecast.
Yeah, through Mayor Shantz to Councillor Cadeau. So right now it's slated for 2025. The number that we have in the budget through this past deliberations was 250,000. That is not a refined number at this time. That's kind of a best guess for staff. But so we're going to look to do some research over the next few months so that when we come back to council in 2024, we'll have a more accurate number for the cost of that facility.
Would it be similar to the one that was recently built in Elmira at the park there?
Again, through your measurements to Councillor Cadeau, we're thinking probably more individual stalls, so maybe 7 universal stalls with one that is fully accessible, which is a little bit different than the one that's in Kate's Cause or Gibson Park with. I'm not sure if you visited that washroom or not, but yeah, a little different style than that one.
Anyone else? There is a recommendation there. Would someone like to move it? Councillor Grant, seconded by Councillor Cadeau. Any further discussion? All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. So we've already discussed item 2 from the consent agenda. That was our delegation earlier. Before we pass a motion approving and receiving the balance of the consent agenda, does anyone want to remove anything? Oh, Clerk Smith, if I turn my page over, there's a note here that he has a comment.
Thank you, Mayor Shantz. Just an error I noticed on item number 1, the Elmira Business Improvement Area budget. If council is acceptable, we would just like to change the resolution to that the council of the Township of Woolwich approve the 2023 budget. We just had the wrong word in there.
Okay, thank you. With that change, would someone like to move the consent agenda? Councillor Cadeau, seconded by Councillor Burgess. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. We have some items for information, which are probably part of the consent agenda as well. Okay. Then we will move on to staff reports, which we have none. Mayor's report on regional matters. Oh boy, I just spent the day at the region. I will put something together later and send it to you on that. Are there any council reports and updates? No. Outstanding activity list. There are no notices of motion. Can I have a motion that the following bylaws in the hands of the clerk be read a first, second, third time and finally passed, and that they be numbered as bylaw number 24-2023 to 32-2023, and that they be signed by the mayor and clerk and sealed with a corporate seal. And you can read those on your agenda. Moved by Councillor Schwint, seconded by Councillor Burgess. All those in favor? And that is carried. Which brings us to the end of our agenda tonight. And I would look for a motion that the meeting adjourns to meet again in regular session on Tuesday, April 25th, 2023. Councillor Grant and Councillor Cadeau, all those in favor? And that is carried. Council would like to thank all who participated or tuned into the meeting tonight on our YouTube live stream. I'll remind council to stay connected until we receive confirmation that the live stream has stopped. Good night, everyone.